I've spent the last 4 weeks in Vietnam with cameraman David Brill.
His name is David Brill.
Renowned cinematographer David Brill travelled back to Vietnam.
David Brill is one of the most experienced newsgatherers in the world.
David Brill is a legendary Aussie cameraman who's survived more war zones than most professional soldiers ever see.
David filmed much of the war and still carries the odd bit of psychological scar tissue himself.
But there's a whole lot more to Brillo's story than guns and danger.
He's taken his camera to every continent, filming revolutions, coups and wars in such countries as Vietnam, El Salvador, Afghanistan.
But his professional sensitivity has proved to be a two-edged sword, and he's had to deal with his own demons. This is David Brill's story.
Longford. Longford's the place I was brought up in, a small town in northern Tasmania. And I was brought up in a hotel. My parents owned a beautiful old hotel called the Blenheim Inn. Looking back on it, it was a pretty lonely existence. Being an only child, I don't think a hotel is a good place to grow up in for a young boy. I loved school very much, but being, which they didn't know then, partially dyslexic, I found it difficult. I wondered why I couldn't spell things or write things down. And no one knew anything about dyslexia in those days. I knew I wasn't stupid. I knew something. I wasn't stupid. But I found it very hard to put down on paper. And I think it made me feel, looking back on it, quite insecure. So I gravitated to pictures. I was president of the Kodak Club. My father bought me a Rolleicord, the cheap version of the Rolleiflex. And I just sort of loved photography. At Longford, just down from the hotel, there was a paper shop, still there. And I'd go in there every week and put on my dad's account Life magazine, Look magazine, National Geographic. But the one I loved was Life magazine, the Bible of all photographic magazines. I loved it. A whole 8 or 9 pages on the Vietnam War. And I could read the stories into those pictures. And that's what really got me in. I thought, this is the stuff, this is the honesty, this is the real gutsy journalism, photojournalism. And so every week, I couldn't wait to go and buy Life. It was only by luck that a teacher at school said to me, who was an amateur photographer, he said, David, have you ever thought of going into a career into photography? Because he knew that my spelling and reading was difficult. And that's what tipped the iceberg. And then Brian Curtis, who owned a big industrial commercial studio in Hobart, came to the school to take all the photographs. And he introduced me, and they wanted to put on a trainee, an assistant, and I got the job. And it taught me a lot about framing, composition. And looking back on it, I think it was a tremendous cadetship. In between that, I got to know some of the people at the ABC. Neil Davis was there. They encouraged me about news cinematography. And so the chief of staff, who I got to know, said, why don't you buy yourself, if you can, a camera, a movie camera, and we'll use you as a stringer. So I got some money together and I bought a Bolex. And so on weekends, they gave me assignments. 100 feet of film, I think we got paid $18. It was a story, and I'd go out on the weekends and maybe do 1 or 2 news stories. Then it built up to 3 or 4, and things went on from there. In the early summer of 1967, around about February, I think it was, the great Tasmanian bushfires happened, Black Tuesday. And I've never covered anything like that before. I'm still pretty young and raw, because I was still the assistant, the trainee, and all hell broke out.
Within a few hours on the afternoon of Tuesday, February the 7th, the southern districts of Tasmania are turned into scorched battlefields. Nothing can stop the flames.
I hated doing it because I felt so guilty of people's homes burning down. It was horrible seeing this stuff. People with nothing, losing everything. So at times I'd put the camera down and go inside and help them, but I realised I had a job to do. So I pick up the camera and film again, but at that time I didn't realise how important it was. I mean, the fires came on so quickly, it was really, looking back on it, like a war zone after a major battle. But what was more than frightening was the pain it caused me of seeing people losing everything and couldn't do anything about it. That film that I'd shot was sent around the world, and it brought a lot of aid to help Tasmania. And I realised, wow, this is powerful.
Eyes! Front!
My other great love, other than Life magazine, was Four Corners. Because I used to watch it religiously, and I'd watch the camera work. They started to have Eclair cameras, the French camera you put on your shoulder, and it becomes part of you, and you can move around, you can tell a story in one shot. And I was hooked on Four Corners. It was, to me, it was the most prestige program, I believe, on Australian television. And I got there. And I worked with some of the great reporters, film editors, cameramen, researchers, the best, highly intelligent people.
The Vietnamese are taking over more and more of the fighting.
And I got to know Mike Willesee quite well. I always liked Mike very much as a human being, and he and I got on very well together. We were a great team looking back on it in those early days. We're both pretty young and, inexperienced.
It's a Monday morning in the Republic of Vietnam. You're listening to the Dawn Buster on the American Forces Vietnam Network.
Before very long, off we go to Vietnam.
It's a sunny day in Saigon. Hope it's good where you are. This is O.C. Smith. Baby, I need your lovin'. Baby, I need your love.
I always wanted to go to Vietnam. I think I was 24 when I was there. For me, I was very excited to go there. The biggest story in the world that didn't just affect America, Australia and its allies, it affected in some way the rest of the world. So, we go to Vietnam, 1970. Mike Willesee, Rob Sloss sound recordist, and me. The first day I arrived in Vietnam, they wanted us to do a quick story, shoot a story in a day or so, and send it back to Sydney, so they've got something, and then stay on for the next 4 weeks or whatever time it took to do a long major piece. We heard about this hospital with the orphans. So we went out to this village, and all these babies, all these orphans with their shaven heads were there. You could see some of them were mixed race, African-American fathers. A lot of the orphans were badly disfigured, crippled, and what future did they have? You see their legs twisted up, behind their back, couldn't walk. What had they done? They have got no family. What was the future of them? And you think to yourself, what can I do? What can I do? And what can you do? And this was back in 1970, and the war went on for another 5 years.
In the peace and order of this orphan village, war should be 1,000 miles away. On the day we visited, the distance was 1,000 yards.
And while we're there, the place came under fire. A couple of bullets came. Ping! What's this about? And we all knew this was really our first time. We're not used to this, or I certainly wasn't. And then there was this helicopter strafing nearby, because I thought it was a Viet Cong holdout there.
And we've just had a couple of shots move disconcertingly close by, I think one within a matter of feet or yards. The battle has no apparent effect on the life of the village.
But life went on in this school with all these orphans, if nothing unusual. And remember, I hadn't long been out of Tasmania. This was really very, very strange, and it was a different world of seeing all this. But I realised again, if it could be done properly, that it's good to show this, of what is going on in the world and what war causes. We were pretty naive, the three of us, when I think about it. We didn't have really any backup in Vietnam, so we felt our way for the first few days. But because of my contacts of knowing Neil Davis from Tasmania, I arranged to meet Neil and introduce him to Mike, and he was wonderful to us by giving us contacts. Neil Davis is one of the greatest combat cameramen in the world in the 20th century. Not just a great combat cameraman, but a great bloke, very helpful. Everybody went to Neil Davis to find out what was going on. It was amazing. He'd been there a few years at this stage. One night he said, look, I know a general very well called General Tu Con Tree. He was a 3-star general. He would be a man to follow around. So Neil rang him up and arranged for us to go into the battlefield. We go out to Ton Son Airport on the outskirts of Saigon, and who should walk out beautifully dressed in the camouflage uniform, baseball cap, 3 stars, cigar, General Tu Con Tree. Shook his hand and said, if you're a friend of Mr. Davis's, you're a friend of mine, let me take you to the war. Not many people, not many journalists went out with the South Vietnamese because it was the American war. It was easy to go with the Americans. You ring up, order a helicopter, come out to the airport, we'll take you into the battlefield. I mean, it's like getting a taxi. But because of Neil Davis, he explained to us that the South Vietnamese were doing most of the fighting. It was their war. So let's go out with the South Vietnamese. So we arranged through Neil to go out and meet this regiment. So we flew in, got out, and they're waiting for us. Oh, welcome, they said. Welcome, thank you for coming. And in front of us, about a mile or so away, was a Viet Cong village, supposedly. To this day, I don't know. But this unit of South Vietnamese soldiers was going in there to sort them out. And they were waiting for us to be ready because they were proud to have a television crew there. I had a French camera, and a clear camera, which is a beautiful camera, but it's prone to jamming, particularly in the tropics with the film gate. The film gets stuck. And they said, ready to go? I said, yes, ready to go. So we slated it, slate 21. I line up the shots and we start to go forward, then they start to open up with their machine guns. And all of a sudden, oh no, the camera jammed right in the middle of all this. Oh, stop! Just out I did, stop! Stop the battle! Stop! I was partly joking, but serious as well. Stop the battle. And they'd stopped. And I said, look, I'm sorry. And then Mike got talking to them and to the colonel. And so I had to get in the black changing bag, which was like a portable dark room. There I'm in the changing bag, and the humidity and the sweat trying to change the film because it broke in the camera. So I'm changing the film. It must have taken 10, 15 minutes. And everyone's been polite to me and no rush. And eventually I changed it, reloaded the camera and said, right, let's go again. Right, the colonel said. And action, slate, whatever number it was, 30. And off we went.
Then a Vietnamese helicopter arrives to remove us from the battlefield. It makes the war seem all the more unreal.
After all that was over, we got off the APCs. I shook the colonel's hand, thanked him very much. We got onto the chopper. I wanted to get some aerials of that area. So we go right up in the helicopter, And I had a headset on where I could talk to the colonel. So I got all these APCs, personnel carriers, into a formation. And I'm hanging out of the helicopter filming. Go left here, would you? Go right there a bit. And they did all that for us. It's only in war that these things could happen. It's bizarre and it's strange. The same thing happened with the US Enterprise aircraft carrier. I'm up in a helicopter and I said to the pilot through the headset, can we get underneath the front of the aircraft carrier to get planes coming up under us? And so he says, this is Chuck 1 to Chuck 2. Dave would like to get some brownies. Yeah, right under the flight path there. Is that possible, Skip? I had control of moving the US Enterprise aircraft carrier to get some shots. The power of the television camera. That's why it's got to be used with utmost respect, because it's such a powerful tool. A lot of people will do things for you if you're there to film it. So we got up to the border of Vietnam and Cambodia, because the American Nixon and Kissinger saying we're not in Cambodia.
This is not an invasion of Cambodia.
I think Tree said that. No American allowed in Cambodia.
No US allowed to come.
So we went into Cambodia, landed in somewhere in Cambodia. And this ragtag army of Cambodian soldiers, boys, 14, 12, 17, lined up, uniforms, which were pretty ancient, and thongs. This was the Cambodian army waiting to meet this general, who was immaculately dressed. They put on this lunch, and they also showed us a lot of the weapons they'd supposedly captured from the Viet Cong. It was bizarre, this lunch with music in the middle of a war. General Tree was a very hard-driving general. A good man, I believe, but tough. Looked very much like an American in many ways, with the big cigar and the dark sunglasses and the whole baseball cap and the whole lot. He was worried that his troops weren't going hard enough, and he'd say to them, I want you to be more aggressive, more aggressive.
General, as I understand it, you've just reprimanded the commanding officer of this regiment for not being aggressive enough and fast enough.
My policy is always to be very aggressive and at any situations.
There'd been a rumour going around that the North Vietnamese were trying to kill him. They eventually did. 3 months later, they shot him out of the sky. What I was learning about war, it wasn't just the guns, the bombs going off, the madness of war. It was the human suffering of people, the innocents, the civilians, mostly civilians. And I remember seeing faces, the anguish on people's faces, how scared they were, not knowing what to do. One day, we're on the outskirts of Saigon at this makeshift hospital for amputees. And this little girl, I think she was probably about 8, was being brought in to be fitted with an artificial leg. Her left leg was blown off in crossfire, so we were told. Her parents were killed. She didn't have anybody except for her grandmother. But she had no expression whatsoever on her face. And she was the most beautiful child I'd ever seen, the eyes. And I thought, what has she done? This one little girl. I thought, this is more powerful if it can be filmed in a dignified way than all the bombs. Great sensational shots of bombs going off, but it's the after effect of bullets and guns and bombs. And they put the leg on, this artificial leg, and she stood on the rails and started to walk, and there was a slight smile there, but you could see the difference in her body language a bit, that it was the first time that she really had her own independence. Rough as it was, at least she could balance herself. And that really hit me like a ton of bricks of the power. And I don't think I'm kidding myself, but to me, that was one of the most powerful sequences I've ever filmed. Anybody could do it, but it was that little girl as an example of what war is about. And that's really led me on for the rest of my life, to try to capture it, but in a good way, not straight in your face, boom, but do it, if you can, in a very dignified, sensitive way, the best you can.
You can look at a human being and measure their suffering and their experience in their faces, I think.
It really wasn't long that I'd been out of Tasmania, a year or two, covering the Vietnam War. And then the war broke out between East and West Pakistan. Well, East Pakistan eventually became Bangladesh. So I was sent to cover that. And that was really an eye-opener.
Nobody knows just how many Pakistan refugees have died in the past few weeks. Death toll figures don't mean much here anymore. For in the face of such misery and suffering, death itself has come as a relief to many.
5 million refugees came down the road from East Pakistan into India. 5 million. They were sick, they were cold, they were suffering from malaria. I remember filming them coming along the road and falling down and dying and left there. And then the Indians wouldn't let them go into Calcutta. They kept them on the outskirts. And they all had to make refugee camps for themselves out of bits of tarpaulin. And the rains were coming. It was really, talk about a disaster, particularly with malaria happening everywhere. Nearby, there was a factory that made huge big pipes. Huge big pipes. Well, the refugees saw these and started to live inside the pipes. It was a credible sight to see these people going in, setting up home in these pipes. But they were still dying. And I remember I was filming some of these very sick people and I heard quack, quack, quack. And I looked up and the vultures were there, waiting to go down and attack the prey, the dead people, just waiting.
On the fringe of a refugee camp in West Bengal, these vultures bide their time, patiently awaiting their next meal of human flesh.
So a few months later, I went back to Vietnam again. Saigon was bizarre. It was fantastic, depressing, dangerous, exciting, very French, very American. It was an amazing place. The thing what I noticed about Saigon was the amount of Americans were there.
Hey, what's happening? What's going on right there? Hey, what's going on? What's happening in the world? Very good.
Not just soldiers, American civilians working for the CIA, a lot of the American aid agencies.
I'm an agent of all airlines.
Agent of all airlines?
Yes.
Which airlines are you agent of, my dear?
Business people. I mean, it was just a mixture of so much activity. And one of the most strangest things in Saigon, they're great gamblers, the Vietnamese, they love gambling. They had the horse races. So we went out and filmed the horse races going on, with a war going on.
For the present, the crowds can afford to be indifferent to war and oblivious to the pervasive presence of troops with their circling watchdogs aloft.
And around you could hear boom, boom, going on. There's a war going on. I mean, life does go on. The war was still going on all right. I mean, the VC were infiltrating the city now and then with bombs they used to put into push-bike pumps and leave the bicycles outside restaurants, and they'd blow up and kill people, kill American servicemen.
He is not throwing grenades at anybody in particular. He is throwing them as a deterrent. The idea is that if these percussion grenades are thrown often enough with sufficient irregularity, then Viet Cong frogmen may not risk swimming to this small naval installation to attach explosives.
All the refugees, all the people are coming in from the countryside because it was dangerous living there, because that's where the Americans were bombing and fighting. One family, there was a husband, a wife. He used to be a soldier. He was a farmer. Now he's a cyclo driver to try to get out and make a few dollars during the day, and that's what he was trying to do, to make a living. His daughter was killed in the war. He had a 6-year-old son, and they were living near this cemetery. Not just them, but people who came in were living in the cemetery, on top of tombs, underneath tombs, all around it.
Their sanctuary is shared by 2,000 other war refugees, living in a chaos of shanties, clinging to the ruins of an ancient tomb.
Undeterred, the voters of Saigon go to the polls.
During this period where they were in Vietnam, they were having elections. They were fixed elections.
They had a vote, but hardly a choice, with only one presidential candidate, the man who already held the job and wanted to keep it. President Thieu and his running mate stared at voters from the only ballot paper. This is the sort of evidence that the Viet Cong left to make their presence felt hours before people went to the polls in Saigon. They lobbed a rocket into this area last night.
So early in the morning, we went up there, and the rocket was still hot. And I filmed this rocket that came into a house right in the middle of Saigon on election day. We wanted to cover election day and maybe get some interviews of President Thieu about how he felt things were going. But no one knew where he was going to vote. But the Fox, as Neil Davis was called, he went to the town hall. So everybody said, if Neil Davis is there, that's where President Thieu's going to vote. So we all go there, waiting for Thieu to come. All of a sudden, Neil gets in his car and screams off. So everybody follows him. They all go except us, because our car wouldn't start. It had broken down. Oh, God, we're going to miss out on this. It was a key part to see the president voting. And all of a sudden, who should come around the corner in a beautiful shiny Mercedes-Benz but President Thieu? We're the only ones there.
The fact that I stay 4 more years or not is less important than I make peace in Vietnam in my term.
In the ordinary sense in which ordinary people use that expression, yes, we have won it.
Ted Sarong, who was a brigadier in the Australian Army, strange man, we interviewed him a couple of times. We arranged to go and have a chat with him at his villa, this beautiful old French villa. And I remember one thing he said during this interview. Basically, he said, the war is won and we have won it.
But in plain talk, in the way ordinary people mean, the war is over, it has been won, and we have won it.
And this was in 1972. And the war went on for another 3 years, and we lost it. We lost the war. In In 1973, under the new Whitlam government, one of his pledges was bring the troops back home from Vietnam. And we were there when he did, when one of the battalions was leaving. A strange thing again, there are these Australians being sent there as conscripts, regular soldiers, for what? And there they were on the back of this truck going to the airport. And it was getting close to Christmas and they were calling out, "We'll be home for Christmas." And then I followed them onto the HMAS Sydney, which was off the coast, and they went back home to Australia.
You will all no doubt be aware that the Australian Task Force is going home. It does not mean the end of Australian interest in your province, as the Australian government is going to donate some $25 million Australian in aid to Vietnam in the next 3 years. And some part of this will most certainly be used to benefit the people of Phuc Tuy.
While the Australians were in the Phuc Tuy province, they built schools, windmills, teaching the Vietnamese how to look after the buildings, how to maintain the windmills.
Can't tell them not to screw it so tight this time.
Thì có mình làm nhỏ nhỏ chút, vặn nó đừng có chặt quá nha.
That's why they broke the other one, they screwed it.
Nếu mà mình vặn chặt quá cái này có dám bị gãy vì nó bằng gang á.
And when they were leaving, they were saying to the Vietnamese, "We're going home, we're leaving you, but we hope you can get on with your lives." But I felt at the time, we're leaving, you know, and I could see it happening in the long run, that the place would be overrun eventually by the North Vietnamese.
And along almost every footpath in Hanoi are these individual air raid shelters. Ham Canyan is the Vietnamese word for them. They're made of reinforced concrete piping with a reinforced concrete lid. There's not very much room inside them, but enough to protect you from flying bomb fragments and falling debris.
In 1973, the opportunity came up for John Pendleton and I to get into North Vietnam. So we got on this Russian aeroplane, and we're the only two Westerners on it going into Hanoi, and that was the most incredible experience for anybody in journalism to think that your country is at war with this country and you were there, the so-called enemy. The first night in Hanoi, I couldn't sleep, either could John. We were just so excited in a journalistic sense of being in North Vietnam. Because John had been in the South, obviously, we'd been there together. And I woke up in the morning and looked out the window of this old French hotel I was staying with, these wonderful old French windows opened up, and all you could see is masses of bicycles with people with pith helmets riding up and down the streets of Hanoi. So I got out there early in the morning and filmed all these bikes and faces and people coming and going. The enemy that I was told all those years since I was a little boy growing up. The Americans bombed their main hospital in Hanoi, and they wanted to show this to us, obviously. And it was the monsoon season when all this was going on. Rain. You never seen rain like it. And when they had the people on the operating table, the soldiers who had been shot or bombed or whatever, they put plastic over them and put their hands under the plastic to do whatever they were doing, the operations, while rain's pouring in. I mean, and Americans say that was a mistake. They bombed that, and I believe, I hope so, it probably was. But the resilience of the Vietnamese, the spirit, you could see then that they weren't going to give up. Didn't matter what anybody did.
I asked the director just how the medical staff managed to keep going during the bombing raids, and he said they did it by keeping their spirits up with songs.
Another extraordinary thing happened while we were in North Vietnam, in Hanoi. We were invited to the airport to film a delegation going off to the Soviet Union. And it was the top brass of North Vietnam. The Prime Minister, General Giap, who actually won the war in the long run for the North Vietnamese, the Defence Minister, they were all there, the top leadership of North Vietnam. And I'm in the middle of them filming. And I remember thinking, here I am in the middle of this most powerful leadership in this war, and on the North side, North Vietnam side, was just a credible part of history for me personally. But I also realised how powerful it would be to show this. Not much of this stuff had ever been shown in Australia before. We're some of the few Westerners to get in there.
The American involvement in Vietnam is coming to an end. The day the South Vietnamese can take over their own defense is in sight. Our goal is a total American withdrawal from Vietnam. I can report that Vietnamization has succeeded.
Vietnamization. The Americans starting to pull out. But when the Americans go in, they take everything with them, including the kitchen sink. But when they leave a lot of this stuff behind. It's cheaper to leave it there than take it back. So I did this tracking shot, a lot of other shots as well, of this big tip around Saigon with all the stuff that was left. Writing desks, filing cabinets, lights, water coolers, you name it, pot plants. On and on and on and on it went. All this incredible stuff. The money, what it cost to get it there, to get it in the first place, didn't mean anything. We interviewed a young soldier who said, oh yes, we're cutting this up and we'll give it, they'll be able to use it for other things. It's cheaper to do it this way than take it back to the States. But again, just bizarre stuff.
Does it ever worry you to see all this stuff here, all the American taxpayers' money ending up on a rubbish dump?
No, it doesn't, because it shows that the United States government is trying to get back some of the money that they have put into the war.
And a lot of the metal stuff were taken into this foundry and melted down into rods of steel. And to see these Vietnamese in this heat, with not a lot of them didn't have the right protective gear on, some of them had metal boots, but the way they were throwing it around, I mean, very primitive stuff. Then they had a ceasefire, supposedly a ceasefire. I mean, it's a joke, but it looks good on paper, I suppose, where they had 4 countries. For the West, Indonesia and Canada. For the East, the Communist bloc, Poland and Hungary. So you had these 4 nations coming together to work out violations of the Paris peace talks, things that were going wrong, fights that were breaking out, battles or rather, breaking out. They were meant to sort all these out and decide who was wrong. And we're out there with them one day. They're all very jovial and very friendly to each other and saluting left, right and centre. But when they sat down, the arguments went on in a very civilised way that on page 734 of document 103, that didn't happen. Oh yes, it did on such a date.
We have an investigation before that, R558 and R564.
Oh, I checked up them and there is only...
And in the meantime, people are getting blown up. I mean, we go on about bureaucracy, but this was bureaucracy in a war. People are still suffering while these 4 nations were trying to work out whether the bit of paper was correct or not. And the wars were still raging on around everywhere.
They want to destroy their own people.
Prince Sihanouk, the God King leader of Cambodia, tried for many years to keep Cambodia out of the war in Indochina. But the North Vietnamese were using Cambodia to bring all their supplies down through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was inside Cambodia, because there were no Americans on the ground there or anybody trying to stop them, except the secret bombing was going on, which Kissinger and Nixon denied was ever happening. But every night I could sit in my room in Phnom Penh and hear the B-52s coming over. Boom, boom, boom. Boom, 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 boom. On my shortwave radio, Nixon is telling the American people we're not in Cambodia.
This is not an invasion of Cambodia.
So we'd go out the next morning to where the bomb craters were, and you see all these huge bomb craters, huge swimming pools, one after another.
But in order to be saved, the country is being destroyed. Cambodia is being bombed as it's never been bombed before.
And I had this idea to show how big these bomb craters were, and I said to Peter Couchman one day, why don't we go out and do a piece to camera? So I put Peter into this bomb crater, right down in it, panned off the side, down into the bomb crater.
Every day there are between 1,500 and 2,000 bombs like this dropped on the Cambodian countryside.
Well, he's not little, Peter's a tall man, but he looks small in this bomb crater, and he started to explain what the bomb craters did.
The bombing capacity that once was reserved for North Vietnam and strategic targets in Laos and South Vietnam now is being directed exclusively at Cambodia.
And he walked out of the bomb crater, as an example. Then we got the hell out of there because the Khmer Rouge were all around that area.
And the bombing goes on. Every night in Phnom Penh, the only sound that breaks the silence of the curfew is the ominous thunder roll of the B-52s as they pound this countryside on the outskirts of the city.
It was a very bizarre war in Cambodia. It was a little war going on in Cambodia compared to the big war next door in Vietnam. Every morning, I'd get into my air-conditioned Mercedes-Benz. We'd fill up a couple of eskies with fresh orange juice, whatever you wanted, sandwiches, fresh sandwiches, white wine if you needed that, cold water, with the eskies in the back of the boot, and off we'd go. And I'd have on the radio classical music. So we'd go out into the war listening to classical music with all our food ready for the day in this air-conditioned Mercedes-Benz, just like out of a movie. But you could only go so far. As Neil Davis said, if there's no one around, no farmers or anybody around, you get out of there fast, because that means the Khmer Rouge or the enemy is around there somewhere. We got stopped at a checkpoint and we wanted to go on a bit further, and the soldiers said, no, you cannot go any further, it's too dangerous. Because what happens, they lay up the road there with B-40 rockets, and they point a rocket, and if it comes into the front of the Mercedes, an example, it waits a second, drills itself in, 1, 2, 3, boom, then explodes. This is the frightening thing. Every day, going out on these roads to see what was happening.
There are many Viet Congs in ahead.
How far ahead? How far down the road?
300 meters from here.
300 meters only. Well, this is what happens on almost every major road or highway out of Phnom Penh now. You drive 10, 15, sometimes even 40 or 50 kilometers, and then suddenly the road ends. We're only about 15, 20 miles from Phnom Penh at the moment, and 300 meters up the road there are a heavy concentration of enemy forces. There are something like 4,000 government troops in there trying to clear the road, but it's still not safe to go beyond this checkpoint.
The Cambodians are quite superstitious, so you had a lot of fortune tellers around telling you what the future holds, what they thought it would be. So we filmed this sequence down on the Mekong River of the fortune tellers telling people who wanted to know that the future was going to be very, very dark. One of the most powerful things I witnessed in Cambodia, it was down on the Mekong one Sunday afternoon. A truckload of soldiers came along to be ferried across the Mekong, the river, to go into a battle. And I looked at these kids they were, on the back of this truck. 2 or 3 of them, they couldn't get off. They were so young and small, they had to be lifted off the truck. These are kids, 10, 11, to be forced to get into the barge and go across into a battle. They didn't want to go. They complained, "We don't want to go. We're scared."
There are many others who don't want to go. You are afraid, we are afraid too, they begin shouting. Why should we go? They are sending us out to die.
And eventually the colonel talked them into going, and they all took off, and everyone's, "Why, good luck, goodbye." I don't know what happened to them, but off they went. These were just children. Swan Lock was a provincial city, town, about an hour and a half helicopter ride from Saigon. And the North Vietnamese regulars were there. There were big battles going on.
But the communists are now using heat-seeking missiles, and in the last few weeks they've been building up very strong forces in this area around Swan Lock.
And it was all hell. The fighting that had gone on the night before, the smell, the dead bodies around. And we interviewed this general who said, "I will hold Swan Lock. I will hold Swan Lock."
If we hold here, I think we can give a good confidence for the people to Saigon.
And you could see that he was being under fire for too long. I mean, he was just shaking and really wound up about it all. I covered everything in that town of all the dead bodies, soldiers wounded on both sides, and I saw North Vietnamese dead. And that was the point, to show how close they were to Saigon, to realise it's all over. I'd been up since 3 o'clock in the morning. This day was a pretty hellish day. I mean, there I was with a big CP16 camera, and I didn't take any water. But the choppers were coming back to pick us up at 5 in the afternoon, an hour before the sun went down. But they couldn't land because the North Vietnamese were rocketing the highway. So they tried to come down, then they'd take off again, they'd come down again. Then one came down, and I did run to get on it. And I just realised I was exhausted, totally exhausted. And it took off again. So I went and laid under this burnt out truck, and there was an NBC correspondent there. He was later killed in Jonestown, at the massacre in Jonestown. And he had a flat jacket, a helmet and a bottle of water. And he said to me, "Hey man, you need this more than I do," and gave me his last bit of water. And I've had that bit of water, and it gave me a bit of strength. I didn't realise until then how important water is to you. Without that water, I don't think I would have had the strength to get onto this chopper. So I got up, ran again to get on it, but I kept going, and the soldiers, the South Vietnamese soldiers, were panicking as well. They were trying to get on this chopper that was there for us journalists. And this young lieutenant, this South Vietnamese lieutenant, I can still see him to this day, pulled out his pistol, held it in the air and went bang, bang, to hold his soldiers back, and allowed me to get on the chopper. And we went up and up, straight up. We didn't go out because the North Vietnamese could have shot us out of the sky. So we just went up and up and up, then we went forward. But it was a crazy day. So we shipped my film. In those days, had to go to Hong Kong and hopefully processed, edited, and then satellited it back. But my film, all that stuff I risked my life to get, let alone the pain and the agony, got lost somewhere. Got lost. And, you know, that was a hell of a letdown to think after all that. So my film was lost, and the only record of that day from an Australian point of view was the film shot by Les Wosley and Alan Hogan from Four Corners. The North Vietnamese were tightening the noose on South Vietnam. They were on a roll to eventually end up in Saigon. People are panicking, trying to get out of the city any way they could, on the roads, bicycles, by water, any way they could. So we went up on an RAAF Hercules to pick up a plane load of refugees, Peter Monkton and myself, ABC correspondent. When we landed in Da Nang, all hell broke out. There was a rush to the plane by the Vietnamese people trying to get out of Da Nang. We just opened the back door of the plane and they all rushed to get on it, trying to help babies on board.
David Brill kept on filming as babies were pulled into the aircraft by their arms, legs and necks.
Peter Monkton passed me babies and I was still filming, so I'd pass them on to somewhere else. And it just, the place just went mad of people panicking. Eventually we had to push them back when the plane was full, closed the door, and we just took off. Things moved very quickly, heading towards the fall of Saigon. The pressure you could feel in the city, the panic was starting to come in, because the South Vietnamese were told there was going to be a bloodbath. So everybody was scared stiff. The North Vietnamese are going to kill everybody. But you could feel the tension building up, people wanting to get out through the Americans, going to the American embassy. And the closer it got, you could see the scrambling of people to get out. We left 3 days before, I think it was, before the fall of Saigon. We were told that that was it. I think they were worried that something might happen to us, so the ABC management suggested we should leave, and we left on the last Australian Hercules to Bangkok. 3 days later, I was in Bangkok, and the word had come through that Saigon had fallen, and Neil Davis, the old fox, he went to the palace and he filmed the ultimate shot of the tank smashing through the gates and the soldiers running up to the palace with the North Vietnamese flag. The war is over, technically the war's over. There's no more shooting, no more bombing. The country's supposedly at peace. But no, the Americans put an embargo on Vietnam to stop supplies and trade going into Vietnam, particularly medical stuff. So they strangled Vietnam for 19 years of this embargo. And they did that because, I believe, because they lost the war. So I went back. When I got there, I couldn't believe the poverty after the war. There was hardly anything around, even food supplies. And so I decided to make a documentary called The Price of Victory. Things like getting computers in. They couldn't get them in. So they're teaching children in schools to make fishing nets. Where anywhere else in the world they'd be learning computer skills. It was really a horrible, sad thing to see, particularly what Vietnam had gone through in the Vietnam-American War. But I realised again how resilient the Vietnamese people are. They're amazing. The great pith helmet, the symbol that everybody wears in peace and in war, the pith helmet. They're making them out of bits of cardboard they found on the street, scraps of cardboard, compressing it, making them into beautiful pith helmets. I've even got one myself. I went to a factory that makes bicycles by hand. These terrific solid bicycles, mainly all women in these factories making these bicycles, churning out hundreds a day. But it was amazing to see this. And then on the outskirts of Saigon again, at a little village, the blind woman who was making beautiful brooms out of straw and going down to the market and selling them. And she was blind. Just 3 examples of the resilience of what the Vietnamese can do. I wanted to go and get a sequence in Ho Chi Minh's house in the middle of the lake in Hanoi, beautiful area. It's where he ran the war from during the Vietnam War. And I said, can I come in, can I go inside and film? And they said, no one goes inside. You have to get permission. That could take weeks, da-da-da-da. And I said, but I need to show a sequence about the great man. I was here, and they said, no one came here. No one came to Hanoi in 73. You were the enemy. You couldn't have been here. I said, well, I'm telling you I was here. But all of a sudden, I see this picture with me in the middle of the Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, the Secretary of the Communist Party, General Zapp, taken in 1973 when I was in Hanoi. And I looked, and I just said, that's me. And they looked, and they said, oh, that's you. I said, I told you, comrades, I was here in 73. You didn't believe me. Oh, they said. And the whole atmosphere changed. And so everything opened up. No, come straight in. So they allowed me to go into the house and film the cabinet room where he ran the war from, the field telephones, his helmet, his bedroom, his single bed where he slept on, where there were pictures and books. It's all there. And it was an amazing experience. So, blow me dead, 5 o'clock that night, knock on my door, wrapped up a newspaper. It was a 20 by 16 print of that official picture. Thank you very much. Can I pay you? No, compliments. No, it's fine. They found that negative and got that thing printed from all those years later and turned up to my hotel with it because I was leaving the next morning. Thank you very much.
Australian veterans returning to Vietnam for the first time 30 years after the end of the war. Dateline's renowned cinematographer David Brill travelled back to Vietnam with the vets.
30 years after the fall of Saigon, 30 years after the end of that dreadful war, I went back to Vietnam with some Vietnam veterans. Men who served there, a lot of them were conscripts, some were regulars. They'd never been back. They were all in their 70s, suffering from alcoholism, mental breakdowns, divorces, you name it. Their doctors and psychiatrists have been saying to them for years, go back, face up to your demons. It could help. But they didn't want to go back. They felt too ashamed to go back. The whole lot of that group were terrific men, and their wives were with them, a lot of them. As they got used to being there, the guilt, I could see it, go away, and they were laughing and smiling and talking. It was the most wonderful experience. One of them, called Bruce Barrow, terrific bloke. You could see him just change. He let the anger out.
I sound angry, and I am fucking angry. You gotta get angry. Everybody's gotta get angry about bloody wars. They're fucking horrible.
And at one stage, they're holding a do for a few delegates from various countries. I was going to film this. So Bruce came with me, and all the delegations from Russia and all the various countries, they were all there. And nearly at the end of it, Bruce gets up and apologises for what he did in Vietnam.
Please forgive me for my involvement in that war. The tragedy to your people is beyond my comprehension. And to be here with you, your wonderful, friendly, warm Vietnamese people, is a major healing factor for the rest of my life. I thank you.
And afterwards, he felt so relieved that he could personally apologise. And back in the hotel in the foyer, he met a North Vietnamese soldier, a former pilot, and they put arms around each other and hugged. And I could see all this shame and guilt leave Bruce. okay today?
Yeah.
I knew on my second trip to Vietnam we'll never win this war. We'll never get anywhere. I can feel it. When I did go back, how proud the Vietnamese are and how forgiving they are. I felt guilty and I'm apologising. They'd say to me, don't worry, we must move on. We must move on. You know, we don't forget, but we must move on and become friends. I've been asked many times over the years, do you think you've made any difference? Well, it's hard to know that. I try to believe with good filmmaking, good journalism, the old cliche word, have you made a difference? Well, I don't know whether we've made a difference, but at least we've explained or try to explain what is going on in the world. So make people sit up and think consistently. The thing about my work, I feel, of looking back on it now, is that it's history. It's more important now in a way, or equally as important now, because it's part of history. And if people look at it, hopefully we try not to make those mistakes again.